We usually imagine medieval bread as coarse, dull, and barely edible, something eaten only because there was no other choice. The popular image is of dark, heavy loaves made by poor peasants, bread that existed purely to keep people alive. But that picture is deeply misleading. In reality, medieval bakers developed methods that produced bread with longer shelf life, richer flavor, and better nutrition than most loaves lining modern supermarket shelves today. Without packaged yeast, industrial milling, or chemical preservatives, they created systems that fed entire towns through harsh winters, crop failures, and even long sieges. What's astonishing is that these techniques weren't accidents or desperate improvisations. They were the result of careful observation, inherited knowledge, and an understanding of ingredients that modern baking often overlooks. In this video, you're going to encounter several medieval bread-making practices that have quietly vanished over time. These methods were so effective that, if revived, they could genuinely change how you bake and think about bread today. And by the end, you'll discover an uncomfortable truth about why we left behind bread that was, in many ways, healthier for us. Before going any further, consider this. Have you ever baked a loaf at home, proud of how it looked, only to find it dry or moldy a few days later? Or bought expensive sourdough from a boutique bakery and wondered why it still doesn't taste as deep or satisfying as you expected? That disappointment isn't your fault. It's the result of missing knowledge. Medieval bakers treated certain principles as essential, while modern baking often treats them as optional or ignores them completely. If you've ever been frustrated by bread that either relies on additives or spoils almost immediately, you're already feeling the gap between old knowledge and modern convenience. Medieval people lived with that knowledge every day. Bread wasn't a side dish, it was survival, and failure wasn't an option. One of the clearest examples of this forgotten wisdom is Maslin bread, a mixed grain loaf designed specifically to endure. Today we divide bread into neat categories: wheat or rye, white or whole grain. Medieval bakers didn't think that way. They understood that blending grains wasn't a compromise. It was intentional food science. By combining wheat and rye, they produced bread that outperformed single-grain loaves in almost every meaningful way. The ratios varied depending on season, region, and harvest, commonly ranging from about 60-40 to an even split. But the real brilliance wasn't simply mixing grains together. It was knowing how those grains interacted. Wheat brought strength and structure through gluten, allowing the dough to rise and hold its shape. Rye, on the other hand, contributed enzymes and natural acids that kept bread moist for long periods and slowed the growth of mold. Together, these grains created a balance that modern food scientists are only beginning to fully appreciate. When researchers reconstructed medieval Maslin recipes and analyzed them, they found that mixed grain loaves retained moisture dramatically longer than pure wheat bread. Mold growth was delayed far beyond what we see in most modern whole grain loaves. Even more impressive, the blend produced a more complete amino acid profile, making the bread nutritionally stronger. Medieval bakers didn't need laboratories to learn this. They learned it the hard way, across generations. They knew that families could endure entire winters on Maslin bread and stored vegetables. Pure wheat bread, despite its status and prestige, simply didn't last. It dried out too quickly and spoiled too easily. Maslin bread endured. For anyone who remembers when food naturally lasted without plastic wrapping or freezers, this kind of loaf would feel familiar. Dense, filling, and built to support long days of physical labor, it was bread that worked as hard as the people who ate it. While modern bakers chased delicate wheat loaves that cost a small fortune and turned stale overnight, medieval bakers produced bread that was cheaper, tougher, and far more reliable. That isn't backward thinking, that's practical engineering. Another striking example of medieval efficiency is trencher bread, a concept that completely changes how we think about eating and waste. In medieval households, bread wasn't always just food. It was also tableware. Trencher bread was baked thick and firm, specifically designed to act as a plate. During meals, it absorbed sauces, fats, and juices, holding everything together without collapsing. By the end of the meal, the trencher had transformed into something else entirely. Saturated with flavor, it could be eaten by the diner or given to the poor. Nothing was thrown away. This system eliminated waste while adding nourishment, all without creating extra work. From a preservation standpoint, trencher bread was remarkably clever. It was often made from older grain or dough that was no longer ideal for lighter loaves. Instead of discarding it, bakers adjusted the process. The dough was under-risen, shaped with pressure, and baked slowly and thoroughly using minimal water. The result was a dense, dry loaf that resisted spoilage and could sit out for days without refrigeration. This bread wasn't meant to be soft. Its purpose was strength. It could support hot food, absorb liquids without breaking, and actually improve in taste as it soaked up the meal it carried. What might seem primitive today was, in fact, a complete system designed around durability and resource management. For modern homesteaders or anyone interested in low-waste living, trencher bread offers a powerful idea, a plate that never needs washing. Food scraps turned into nourishment. Bread made from ingredients that would otherwise be thrown away. Historical records from England show that large households baked trenchers by the hundreds, storing them for weeks at room temperature. When archaeologists and food historians recreated these breads using traditional methods, they found that the loaves remained edible and structurally sound for over a month. What all of this reveals is something we rarely admit. Medieval bread culture wasn't crude or accidental. It was intentional, tested, and refined over centuries. We didn't abandon these methods because they failed. We left them behind because speed, uniformity, and profit became more important than resilience, nutrition, and flavor. In gaining convenience, we lost knowledge. And in losing that knowledge, we forgot that bread could be more than something that barely lasts until the weekend. Now compare that with the average sandwich loaf today. A bread that starts growing mold within 5 days, even though it's packed with preservatives and sealed in plastic. Medieval bakers were solving problems that modern food science still struggles to fully overcome. Sailors in the medieval world faced a challenge that would defeat most modern bakers. How do you make bread that can survive months at sea, stored in damp, rat-infested ship holds, with no refrigeration, no chemical preservatives, and not even airtight containers? Their solution was twice-baked ship's bread, a method that may have produced the longest-lasting bread ever consumed by humans. The process began with a simple dough, usually made from wheat or barley, mixed with as little water as possible. The result was an extremely stiff dough, far firmer than anything used in modern baking. This dough was shaped into thick biscuits or flat cakes and baked once until fully cooked. Then came the critical step that changed everything. After cooling completely, the bread was baked again at a lower temperature for several hours, and sometimes even baked a third time. Each additional baking removed more moisture until almost none remained. What emerged was bread so hard it could break teeth if eaten dry, yet so stable it bordered on indestructible. Maritime records from Venetian and Genoese trading fleets describe ship's bread remaining edible for more than a year. Portuguese sailors traveling to India carried bread baked before departure and were still eating it 6 months later after crossing the equator twice. The brilliance of this method lay in a simple insight. Moisture is the true enemy of food. Every mold, every bacterium, and every form of decay requires water to survive. Remove the water completely, and bread becomes dormant. Medieval bakers understood that twice-baked bread, when kept dry, could outlast the voyage, outlast the sailor, and still remain safe to eat. For modern preppers, or anyone interested in long-term food storage without electricity or specialized equipment. This technique offers something remarkable: bread that doesn't last days or weeks, but entire seasons. It requires nothing more than heat, time, and patience. When it was time to eat, the bread wasn't chewed dry. It was soaked in wine, beer, broth, or water, where it softened, absorbed flavor, and became food again. No waste, no spoilage, just bread that refused to fail. Medieval bread, however, wasn't only about endurance. It was also used as medicine. Step into a medieval monastery infirmary, and you would find something modern medicine has largely forgotten. Bread baked specifically for healing, not bread as a container for medicine, but bread as medicine itself. Rye and honey bread combined two ingredients medieval physicians believed had powerful healing properties. Rye was valued for its ability to calm digestion and reduce inflammation, something modern research now confirms. Honey, especially raw honey, was recognized as a natural antibacterial substance that suppresses harmful microbes while supporting beneficial ones. The true mastery lay in how these ingredients were brought together through fermentation. Medicinal breads were fermented slowly, often for 3 to 5 days. This long process allowed natural bacteria to break down complex starches and produce lactic acid, improving both preservation and digestibility. Honey was usually added late in the process to protect its antibacterial qualities, which high heat can destroy. Monastery records from the 13th century describe different bread formulations for specific conditions. Loaves for digestive problems used extra honey and fennel seeds. Bread for respiratory complaints included herbs like thyme and horehound mixed directly into the dough. Bread intended for recovery after injury or illness was baked exceptionally dense and rich, designed to nourish patients who could not handle solid meals. Modern analysis supports much of this knowledge. A 2015 study examining reconstructed rye and honey breads found that fermentation produced compounds with measurable anti-inflammatory effects. The bread also supported beneficial gut bacteria more effectively than many modern whole wheat loaves. Medieval bakers created bread that didn't just fill the stomach, it supported the body's systems. Fermentation reduced compounds that caused bloating and discomfort. Honey provided steady energy without sharp blood sugar spikes. Rye delivered fiber and nutrients in a form the gut could actually process. Finally, there was forest bread, a quiet safeguard against famine. When wheat and rye harvests failed, medieval communities didn't immediately starve. They turned to the forests. Acorns and chestnuts, now often dismissed as inedible, became life-saving staples. These nuts were dried, ground, and carefully processed to remove bitterness before being mixed into flour. This bread sustained entire populations during crop failures. It wasn't soft or refined, but it was dense, nourishing, and dependable. Forest bread represented deep ecological knowledge, an understanding that survival didn't rely on a single crop. It relied on knowing the land and using what it offered. Together, these breads tell a story we rarely hear. Medieval baking was not crude or ignorant. It was deliberate, resilient, and shaped by centuries of experience. We didn't abandon these methods because they failed. We left them behind because speed and convenience became more valuable than durability, nutrition, and long-term resilience. And the bread made from them kept people alive when grain-based loaves were no longer possible. Acorn bread depended on a kind of knowledge that has nearly vanished today. Raw acorns contain high levels of bitter tannins, substances that can be harmful if consumed in large amounts. Medieval communities understood this and developed careful leaching methods that removed the toxins while preserving the nut's nutritional value. The process was slow and deliberate. Acorns were shelled, roughly crushed, and soaked in flowing water for days, sometimes even weeks. The water was replaced again and again until the bitterness disappeared completely. What remained was a mild, nourishing meal. This was then dried, finely ground, and mixed with whatever grain was available, often in ratios that favored acorn flour over scarce wheat or rye. The result was bread that could be made even when fields produced nothing. Chestnut bread followed a different path. Chestnuts required less detoxification but demanded careful drying and grinding. Once turned into flour, they produced a loaf that was naturally sweet, dense, and deeply satisfying. Because chestnuts are rich in starch, this bread could be made with very little grain, allowing limited supplies of wheat or barley to be stretched much further. In mountainous regions of Italy, particularly Tuscany and Corsica, chestnut bread traditions survived well into the 20th century. Elderly villagers interviewed in the 1972 recalled their grandparents describing chestnut bread as superior to grain bread for sustained energy during long days of physical labor. Modern nutritional analysis confirms those memories. Acorn flour contains high levels of protein, healthy fats, and essential minerals rarely found in refined grain bread. Chestnut flour provides slow-releasing carbohydrates that deliver steady energy, rather than the sharp rise and crash associated with modern white bread. Together, or on their own, these forest breads represent something that should matter to everyone watching this. Food security that does not depend entirely on agriculture, global supply chains, or grocery stores. Knowledge that could determine the difference between hunger and survival if the systems we rely on were ever disrupted. Another forgotten technique reveals itself in ale balm bread, what could be considered the original sourdough. Long before commercial yeast, and even before traditional sourdough starters became common, medieval bakers relied on a powerful byproduct of brewing. Ale balm was the thick foam skimmed from actively fermenting beer. Every village brewed ale, and every brewer produced balm. Bakers knew that this froth was liquid gold. Ale balm wasn't just a convenient shortcut. It was an advanced leavening agent that combined cultivated yeast with the natural preservative properties of hops and barley. Timing was everything. Roughly 12 to 24 hours after brewing began, foam rich with living yeast would rise to the surface. Bakers collected this balm and mixed it directly into flour and water. Dough that might otherwise take days to rise with wild fermentation would lift within hours. What made ale balm bread exceptional wasn't just speed. Hops contain natural antimicrobial compounds, and those compounds passed into the foam and then into the bread itself. The result was a loaf that resisted mold far longer than bread made using other methods. English baking records from the 16th century describe ale balm bread remaining fresh for a week or more, even in damp environments where other loaves would spoil quickly. The flavor also stood apart. Slightly malty, subtly bitter, and layered with complexity from barley and hops, it produced bread that was both light and filling. For modern bakers frustrated by unpredictable sourdough starters, ale balm represents a forgotten alternative. Anyone who brews beer today is quite literally discarding ideal bread yeast with every batch. Medieval people understood that brewing and baking were not separate crafts. They were interconnected parts of a single food system where nothing went to waste and every process supported another. Perhaps the most practical method of all was salt-preserved dough, a technique almost unknown today. Medieval bakers did not maintain sourdough starters through constant daily feeding. Instead, they preserved the dough itself. By heavily salting a portion of risen dough, they created a living culture that could be stored for months. The process was straightforward. A piece of successful dough was mixed with a substantial amount of salt and stored in a cool, dark place. The salt slowed fermentation to a near standstill, preventing spoilage while keeping the yeast alive in a dormant state. When baking day arrived, the baker removed a portion of this preserved dough, rinsed away excess salt, added fresh flour and water, and allowed it to warm. Within hours, the yeast reactivated, and the dough rose as if it had never rested. Monastic baking records describe this as standard practice. Many monasteries baked bread only once or twice a week, yet their dough culture never died. Some records suggest certain monasteries maintained the same dough lineage for decades, passing it from one baker to the next. The result was bread with a consistent flavor and character that became part of the monastery's identity. Modern bakers who have recreated this technique report remarkable results. Salt-preserved dough produces bread with deep flavor complexity. The long resting period allows enzymes to slowly break down starches, creating natural sweetness and richness impossible to achieve with quick-rise methods. Long before packaged yeast or even classic sourdough starters, medieval bakers had already solved the problem. Make dough when time allows. Preserve it. Use it when needed. No daily feeding. No waste. Bread that adapts to your life, not the other way around. All of these methods share a deeper truth. Medieval bakers did not see bread as an isolated product. They understood it as part of a complete system. Bread was tied to brewing, to forest stewardship, to medicine, and to community welfare. Each technique represented knowledge refined over generations and abandoned in moments when industrial baking promised speed and convenience. In that trade, we gave up resilience for efficiency. We sacrificed nutrition for uniform packaging. We replaced bread that sustained people through brutal winters with loaves that are little more than air and preservatives. The question is no longer whether medieval bread was better. In nearly every way that matters, the evidence suggests it was. The real question is whether we are willing to relearn what we lost. If you're tired of bread that fails you, if you want techniques that actually endure, then stay with this channel. We explore forgotten food knowledge every week. Share which of these breads you would try first. This isn't just about baking. It's about reclaiming skills that once made people self-sufficient. Skills that didn't depend on factories, fragile supply chains, or corporations deciding what belonged on your plate. Medieval bakers understood something we are only beginning to remember. Real bread doesn't require a long list of unpronounceable ingredients. It requires knowledge, patience, and respect for the craft. That's what we're bringing back.